Fred was better. If I can have your attention again. Thanks to my colleagues up here for their excellent glass clinking. Again, I'm Tom Nagorski, and we welcome you to this event. Thank you for bearing the, somebody said it's kind of a Hong Kong swelter out there today, and we're glad to have you all here as we mark 2 decades since the Hong Kong handover and reflect on those 20 years and look ahead as well. We welcome you all, of course, but just a few special words of welcome to some members of the Asia Society family here. Our Vice Chair, Lulu Wang, great to have you with us today. To former trustee Miranda Tang and Hamburg Tang, we thank you. It's great to have you here. And we have 2, not 1, but 2 Asia Society presidents at the center table here, both current president and CEO and my boss, Josette Shirin, and 3 to her left, our President Emeritus, former President, Ambassador Nicholas Platt. Thank you all for being with us today. And a thank you as well to our partners for this event. We've done it not every year, but many years now. Michael Kwan from HKETO, the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office, Steve Barkley, who you'll hear from in a moment, Karen Tang and Jimmy Chow from the Better Hong Kong Foundation. We appreciate the partnership. A couple of quick words. I promise to keep these brief about Asia Society events. We're not normally in the habit, no matter what the weather, of doing big all-day seminars or forums on Fridays in the summer. But we had the opportunity to partner with the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce on a big event that is tomorrow, which of course is a summer Friday, on the U.S.-India relationship with a focus on business, but there's a lot of other elements to this run by our Policy Institute here. Kevin Rudd, who is the president of the Policy Institute, will be here. Leaders in both Indian and American business and policymakers. The Indian ambassador of the United States will be with us. We also, by the way, have for one of the afternoon sessions tomorrow a pair of top stars from Bollywood. There are tickets available for some of the sessions still. If you're interested, given that this is just tomorrow, please catch one of my colleagues on your way out or check with the front desk downstairs. We also don't often stage major exhibitions in our galleries in the summer here in New York, but we have done so. Hope it's the start of a great tradition. Certainly this exhibition is extraordinary, so maybe on your way out or another day between now and August 6th when it closes. It's gotten great reviews. The exhibition is called Lucid Dreams, South Asian Art in the Diaspora. These are beautiful works by 19 contemporary artists from South Asia who have made their homes and the bulk of their art in this country. So to this afternoon's event, some of us remember, we've been talking at my table here, exactly where we were on and around the date of July 1st, 1997. I have actually been boring my colleagues with my own reflections. I was among in retrospect, really huge and kind of unwieldy group of people from ABC News who, like a lot of the other major networks from around the world, were parachuted into Hong Kong to cover the handover, to watch and cover those strange and carefully choreographed moments as Hong Kong was returned to China. I think the one most people remember is Prince Charles standing in that magnificent Hong Kong downpour monsoon that actually at least one point cut off our transmission from Hong Kong, but that's another story. And then, of course, sailing off with the last British governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten, on the royal yacht Britannia. Some in Hong Kong cheered. Some were very anxious. Some in Hong Kong, I don't know how many, actually left. Their anxieties were that great. And 20 years later, then, a great many people have been reflecting and taking stock. What's changed and what hasn't. What anxieties were justified, which were overblown, and what new issues have arisen that were not imagined then. The anniversary has coincided with a lot of other news in Hong Kong. New chief executive has taken office. Xi Jinping has visited. There have been protests, and there have been a lot of conversations, and we'll get into some of that today, about the future of the one country, two systems concept and idea. Joining us here today, I think you all have their bios if you don't know them already. Ronnie Chan, chairman of Hang Lung Group, co-chair of the Global Asia Society Board and chairman of its Hong Kong Center. Beyond that, I just would say, as I do whenever Ronnie is on our stage or in our midst. Just a great and loyal friend for a long time of this institution. Yep. And to say that he's chair of the Hong Kong Center really doesn't do that justice either. He is really the founding father, or one of the founding fathers of Asia Society Hong Kong, and I know most of you at this occasion in this room have been there, but if you haven't, it's worth a special trip there, and certainly if you're in Hong Kong, you have no excuse not to visit. Tammy Tam is editor-in-chief of the South China Morning Post. Great to have Tammy with us. She's just about 1.5 years in that role now. Started her career in journalism at the Hong Kong Standard before shifting to television, working at Television Broadcast Limited, iCable, ATV. Helped launch, by the way, Hong Kong's first 24-hour television news channel. And Ben Zhang, who's a member of the Executive Committee of Haitong International Securities Group, Vice President of the Chinese Asset Management Association of Hong Kong, also an adjunct professor of finance at the East China University of Science and Technology's School of Business. But to get us started, before they come to the stage, I do want to invite, representing our partner, HKETO, Steve Barclay. Steve is director of the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office here in New York. He's served a wide variety of posts within the Hong Kong government, and I told Steve I'd embarrass him, but Steve is about to retire, so of course we wish him all the best. But while we are all here, yes. And we're here reflecting on 20 years ago. This is the embarrassment part. Steve Barclay has roots that trace almost 40 years back, 40, to when he first joined the Hong Kong government as an inspector in the Hong Kong police. And all the time I've known you, Steve, I never knew that. Invite you to kick us off. Thank you.
Telling people that you were a police officer doesn't always ensure you have the best company in a bar, Tom. I sometimes find empty seats next to me all of a sudden. Thank you very much for that introduction, Tom. Josette, Ronnie Chan, Tammy, Ben, members of the Better Hong Kong Foundation, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. 2 weeks ago, Hong Kong celebrated the 20th anniversary of the establishment of the Hong Kong SAR. President Xi attended the 20A activities in Hong Kong and the inauguration ceremony of the fifth term of the Hong Kong government. He reaffirmed the central government's commitment to the one country, two systems principle and stated very clearly that the practice of one country, two systems has given Hong Kong an institutional advantage, that it enables Hong Kong to share in the mainland's vast market and development opportunities, and allows Hong Kong to serve as a testing ground for new initiatives. The same day, on July the 1st, we saw the inauguration of the fifth term government led by the city's first female chief executive, Mrs. Carrie Lam, who spoke here about a year ago in her capacity as Chief Secretary. I would tell you that Carrie Lam is probably, after Ronnie, Hong Kong's most ardent supporter of the Asia Society, and that you're very fortunate to have her in Hong Kong. I'm sure that you will get maximum support from the new government for at least the next 5 years. In her inauguration address, Carrie Lam reiterated that she will resolutely do everything within her ability to implement the one country, two systems principle, uphold the basic law, and defend the rule of law. So far, it seems that unlike her predecessor, she's enjoying a honeymoon. We'll see how long that lasts, but fingers crossed. Now, there's no doubt, I think, that Hong Kong has been economically very successful in the post-97 period. Of course, we haven't seen the double-digit growth that we saw in the 80s, but most of that time, most of those 20 years, we've been in positive growth territory, which not many economies can claim. Of course, there was no historical precedent for one country, two systems. Despite all the problems, we have prevailed and prospered despite the pessimism of many pre-1997. After 1997, we have faced enormous problems. Bird flu, swine flu, the 1998 Asian financial crisis, millennium bug, SARS, global financial crisis, daily demonstrations, I think probably daily for 20 years, as well as minor problems like high housing costs. But actually, relatively few of our problems have involved the dire predictions of the doomsayers pre-1997. Hong Kong remains a shining beacon of free trade, open markets, the rule of law, judicial independence, low taxes, a level playing field for local and foreign companies alike, and not many people can say that, a high degree of transparency, and a society with a low tolerance for corruption. We continue to have unfettered access to information and freedom of speech, and guarantees of all the other freedoms, such as education, religion, employment, movement, and so on. In a recent interview with the SCMP, and in this very room last month, the US's top envoy in Hong Kong, the Consul General, Kurt Tong, I think was far more balanced than most commentators and observers of Hong Kong. And he said that his view was that the one country, two systems governing formula was, by and large, working well. I remain confident about the future of Hong Kong for many reasons. First of all, generations of Chinese leaders have wanted Hong Kong to succeed. Hong Kong people continue to have a can-do spirit. The rule of law remains rock solid, and our judiciary remains fiercely independent. So confident am I, I'm about to retire there. I'll leave our more distinguished speakers to elaborate on some of my points. Thank you very much.
No more speeches from me. I need our panelists up here. If Ben and Ronnie and Tammy can join me up on the stage. Thank you. You can take the hop. Or, okay. Actually, while they're doing that, I forgot one little thing. Frequent visitors will have this memorized, but we live stream these events. And so we have an audience well beyond this room, and maybe some insomniacs in Hong Kong or interested parties. But if you have a question and you are watching from beyond the room, you can email them to moderator@asiasociety.org or tweet them using the hashtag AsiaSocietyLive, which is also the hashtag for this event. Now, Steve has just given us a lot to chew on. And we had a lot to chew on even before Steve's remarks, but I do want to come back. Is there a little bit of an echo here? Maybe that's just in my ears. I want to come back just to Tammy for one moment on where we began about an hour ago with Liu Xiaobo. And that is just to say, as a, well, first of all, you told me just before the event that you had met him on a few occasions. But I wonder if you have any reflections and also any thoughts as an editor to, you know, say a few words as to, do you think beyond the tragedy, beyond the human story here, as an editor of the major paper in Hong Kong, is this going to be a story, do you think, that will carry on for a while? Is it possible even to predict?
As I told Tom just now, actually, I personally, I met Liu Xiaobo a couple of times because beyond, every June 4 anniversary is a big event for Hong Kong media. So even after 1997, I also went to Beijing to during this June 4 anniversary, interview different dissidents, including Wang Dan, and Liu Xiaobo is one of them. To me, he's always remained as a very moderate, quiet, but very determined teller of the inconvenient truth in China. I mean, personally, I respect him a lot, and his death is such a tragedy. Personally, I also feel very sad for his family. As an editor of the South China Morning Post, this is a major story, at least for my paper. Our paper has been covering Liu Xiaobo's final conditions over the past weeks or so. And we are also preparing a leader to be appeared in tomorrow's paper to commemorate this, as I said, he's a determined teller of the inconvenient truth of China, and he's a real democracy fighter. I think in Hong Kong, this is a big news. And I also believe in the coming days, there will be still more stories on Liu Xiaobo. Tom asked me just now whether there will be big protest. Honestly, I think there will be protest in Hong Kong for this. And that also comes back to one country, two systems. The fact that in Hong Kong, we can report Liu Xiaobo freely, and people can protest against the Chinese government on the treatment on Liu Xiaobo. All this actually it shows the beauty of the two systems. I think only in China, Hong Kong perhaps is the only city that we can do all this legally. So that's my personal reflection on this.
Yeah. No, I appreciate your sharing that. Just to come back to the subject at hand, and it's a bit of an odd segue, but I've mentioned, and we've been talking here about where everybody was 20 years ago, people particularly with long time history and roots in Hong Kong. So Ben Zhang actually is from Anhui province in China and was at Duke University as a student. So he's about as far from Hong Kong on July 1st, 1997 as can be. Tammy was in Beijing covering the story as a Hong Kong TV anchor. But Ronnie, I think I got to pick on you for this one because I knew you'd been in Hong Kong, but Ronnie has some interesting reflections on the rain and interpretations on the rain, and I'm just going to leave it at that. And if you'd like to share those or anything else.
Okay. I was, usually the British don't like to invite me to anything. I'm an outsider. I'm fiercely independent such that the Chinese don't invite me, the Beijing people don't, Britain doesn't invite me, nobody invites me. Maybe that's why I'm in Asia Society, but anyway. So I was really surprised that the British invited me to the last ceremony because I have consistently turned down every honor, positions, whatever, before 1997 by the British, after 1997 by the Chinese, and just never accept any honors or positions. And so my wife and I said, well, if you're invited, why not? Let's go. So it rained, you remember, right? You saw the photograph over there. And as we were walking away, there was this old British couple that I've known for decades, good friend of ours, and the rain. They said, "Wow," she said, "Heaven is crying for the leaving or departure of the British," and I said, "Oh, is that right? Or perhaps heaven is trying to cleanse away all the sins of colonialism." But anyway, it depends on how you look at it, and you can interpret it whichever way you want. But I think that this does say something deeper, and that is, the return of Hong Kong really signals the end of an era that lasted 500 years, and that's colonialism. And a lot of people don't put the Hong Kong return in a greater context. It's a sad chapter of human history called colonialism, but whatever it is, it is. And you have to accept, facts. And I think that, I know Macau went back 2 years later, but Macau is a little bit small. Yeah. So Hong Kong really signals the end of a collective history, not just Hong Kong people. Later we'll go to the Hong Kong people, but a collective history of the world, of the end of the colonialism. And so I think that it was very significant. So my wife and I are so happy that day. The only thing is that what I didn't know was the next day is going to be equally good for me. That is, Asia financial crisis hit, and I bring a lot of money out of it, but anyway, that's another story.
Yeah, that is another story. Okay. Reflections I mentioned, there have been many. One of the things about doing this event on the 13th of July rather than, end of June or 1st of July is I've had and we've all had the opportunity to read a lot of publications and organizations and people just commenting and giving their own reflections. I was taken by this one from The Economist, which wrote a few weeks ago, taking note of what they had said in 1997. So they said, and I'm just interested in any of your reflections on this, we as a newspaper expressed hope that Hong Kong would help change China politically. The opposite is happening. The hand of China is now being felt more than it should, more than the people of Hong Kong would like. Do you think that's right? Do you think they're right? And maybe we start with Ben, just because Ben hasn't, or do you want to stick to financial matters?
Well, first of all, I have to admit that my experience with Hong Kong is shortest here. That's why I have my notebook here. So I did a little bit of research regarding the 20 years what happened in Hong Kong. And I'll come back to answer your question later on. But let me give you a little bit numbers. So numbers speak itself, right? So what happened in the last 20 years in Hong Kong as an economy as overall? So the GDP growth in the last 20 years, annually 3.2% as a developed economy, better than Japan, better than European Unions. As a matter of fact, the first quarter this year recorded 4.2% again, right? The FX foreign exchange reserve increased 4 times, right? I look at employment, the 4 primary sectors in Hong Kong. For example, the financial sector, which I'm in, increased by 40%. Now, 250,000 people work in financial service industry out of 7 million Hong Kong residents. That's pretty high density.
And they account for 18% of the GDP.
Yeah. Then look at tourism sectors. The employment increased by 180%. Then the specialty professional services increased by 70%. I guess lawyers, accountings, a lot of services there. So overall economy actually I think is doing okay. But to come back to your question, I have an economic answer, which is a little bit maybe too relate to my industry. People feel about recently a lot of Chinese money, mainland Chinese money coming to Hong Kong market by the way of Stock Connect, so-called southbound, right? Of course, there's northbound money, northbound capital from Hong Kong pour into Shanghai and Shenzhen stock exchange as well. Then there's a puzzle. The game of stock market is different in Hong Kong and Shanghai, Shenzhen. Before, Shanghai is more like storytelling and growth sectors. Hong Kong is more value-driven because you look at the underlying investor structure. 70% Hong Kong investors are institutional investors. They tend to be more value-driven. However, more than 80% of mainland stock exchange investors are retail investors. So that's the difference. So then now you have this commingle of capital flows. So which actually lead to which? We actually did a study. We find out actually, to a lot of people's surprise, is Hong Kong's way of investment, value-driven, actually impacting China, the Shanghai, Shenzhen more than the other way around. So
that's, as you say, that's a financial look at the
that's
question.
from financial impact. Yeah.
Can I add to what is just said?
Of course, yeah.
In the old days when I go around talking to people that are shareholders of mine and potential shareholders of my publicly listed company, I only go to New York and London, basically. And now, like it or not, you have to go to Shanghai and Beijing. And that's why Hai Tong and those guys, and also the quality of the research has really, really improved in the last 20 years. And I think that's another area where Hong Kong, unspokenly, unnoticeable to most people, have been affecting mainland China, to answer your question. And the corporate governance, I think, is also improving in the mainland because of these interconnectivities between Hong Kong and mainland China economically and financially. But if I'm allowed to go to your question about Hong Kong and whether Hong Kong help or not. First of all, I believe that Deng Xiaoping, when he started this one country, two system, he no doubt not just have Hong Kong and Taiwan in mind, but he also have mainland China in mind. that perhaps what happened in Hong Kong can be, in some ways, if not always, be learned from by mainland China so that it can become useful in mainland China one day. I believe that that must be Deng Xiaoping's behind his thoughts as well. However, the reality is, whereas Hong Kong has, helped and influenced China in many, many ways, such as what I just mentioned, mainland China has just gone on so fast that it has, in so many areas, in technology, in so many areas that I think Hong Kong have to be careful. Let's not, and the West, sorry to say, such as this question, is frozen in time. That as if, they are always better. I mean, Hong Kong is always better. Mainland China is always behind. In many areas, still true. But also in other areas, we are left behind in Hong Kong. So I think that question has to be taken with a grain of salt, that a lot of areas, mainland has learned from Hong Kong, but on the other hand, Hong Kong should also learn from China. Finally, of course, a lot of people talk about, what about politically, it's really, the first 10 years, roughly, Beijing really left Hong Kong totally hands off. Let Hong Kong people take care of Hong Kong, which I fault Beijing for doing that. I understand. I appreciate their good heart. I fault, F-A-U-L-T.
Okay. Yes.
I fault them for doing that. Although I understand and appreciate the good-heartedness to not meddle in Hong Kong. But the reality is, Hong Kong people is undergoing some real serious identity problem. And so, as a result, a lot of things are happening, as you see. And one of them is that there is always a small segment of society who wants, who are extremists. Every society has that. In Hong Kong, for example, have you ever seen the video that a soccer game in Hong Kong when the national team played the Hong Kong team? 50 university students, when the national anthem was played, they turned their back against the flag. This is the august audience. I should be careful, and I'm the co-chair of the Asian Society, so I never should use bad words. But they gave the flag the middle finger. And they chanted, and the only, French word I know start with the F, Beijing. They chanted that. And that's too much. And so I think that, and these things, if you are sitting in Beijing, you don't, you would think twice. What's going on in Hong Kong? The Union flag waving in Hong Kong. So I think that I can see why Beijing is a little bit cautious also and say, hey, come on, guys, one country.
Okay, I have a lot of follow-ups, but one leads right to Tammy, which is, you said something to me, and we had limited time earlier about, in your view, neither side, well, I shouldn't put words in your mouth, but just the difficulties on both sides with one country, two systems. And I think you've written about this in your paper, but you can explain what you think those are. And feel free to disagree with Ronnie, too, if you like.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm a journalist, so I always have a critical mind. Well, that recalls me something, on June the 30th and July the 1st, I was in Beijing, and 20 years ago, I was still with TV at the time. So throughout the whole day, I was doing live coverage from Tiananmen Square, and I saw this jubilant, joyful crowd in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And then I call back to my office in Hong Kong. I think, hey guys, what's happening in Hong Kong? It's pouring. And everybody's feeling kind of upset. And I honestly...
Because of the rain.
Well, whatever. But honestly, I think I had a very much kind of a mixed feeling when I stood in Tiananmen Square. Because it's all this kind of uncertainty. I really don't know next morning, next day, what will happen to Hong Kong. I believe many of my colleagues back in the newsroom, they share the same similar kind of sentiment. That also reminds me, during I have been in Beijing for many years, covering the transition, the Sino-British talks on the Hong Kong transitions. And the Chinese officials kept telling us, they said, hey, Hong Kong reporters, don't worry. When July the 1st comes, except the change of the flag, nothing will change. Everything will remain the same. So I kept asking the question, is it that simple for one country, two system to implement? Does it mean just the change of flag? Anything will not change? So 20 years after looking back, I think that has been a painful learning process for both Beijing and for Hong Kong people as well. Because as Deng Xiaoping said, that there's no successful precedent, no reference. Nobody knows what this one country, two system is. So everybody is kind of crossing the river by touching the stones. I use Deng Xiaoping's quote. They don't know how to do it. So at the beginning, it's my experience when I interviewed all these Beijing officials, the Chinese officials, I asked them, what's this one country system all about? Oh, they said, what we need to do is to protect the interest of capitalism. We just protect capitalism. And to them, their understanding is to protect the interest of the business. Well, Ronnie is from the business, I'm not offending you. But Hong Kong is much more complicated. It's not just for the interest of the business that can keep Hong Kong, everything is rosy, is right. And on the other hand, Hong Kong people, we are also learning. I mean, before 1997, we were under the British rule. We were asked to do whatever the British government was asked to do. So after 1997, we think that we are the master of the city. We want to make our own decision. And Hong Kong people becomes more demanding to the government as well. However, there are so many things, besides just protecting the interests of the business. We have our housing problem, we have our poverty, education, young people, and plus the Asian financial crisis the next year. So everything seems went wrong in Hong Kong. So people started to think about it. As a media person, I once thought about it, I should change my career after 1997 because I thought there would be no big news. Everything would be settled. However, I came to realize the big news just started after 1997.
It's a great time to be in your position, isn't it?
I think so. Until today, that's why I'm still staying in this business, in journalism. So I think for the very beginning, China wants to give us free hands. I don't mind your business and you don't mind my business either. Until 2003, because of SARS and the legislature of the national security law and many things, and then 500,000 people marched to the streets. And Beijing started to think, hey, let me give you some preferential policies. So they sent us the tourists, and they gave us SIPA, and they gave us
socio-economic cooperation.
Many other economic policies. However, people didn't seem happy either. From a journalist perspective, I think it's because all these policies is kind of a one way, and it's still in the eyes of many ordinary Hong Kong people, it still benefits the business, not very much benefit to the people in the streets.
Like in the United States with Donald Trump?
So this time when President Xi Jinping came to town to mark the 20th anniversary of Hong Kong's return to China, some people also talk about whether President Xi will bring with him some big gifts to Hong Kong.
Economic gifts.
Because Hong Kong people just kind of get used to, whenever a state leader came to town, they must bring with them some kind of gifts to Hong Kong, which means as policies. But this time, I came to realize there is a gift, but not the conventional way. The gift was President Xi told Hong Kong, you need to grab the opportunity of the country's development. You be part of the country's development, like the One Belt, One Road and the Greater Bay Area the projects. So you should be part of that national development project. and to develop together with the country rather than just, I give you something and then, you do it your way. So I think there's a number of adjustments for Beijing's Hong Kong policy over the past 20 years. To me, that's a learning process for mainland China and for Hong Kong people as well. We need to try to also understand why Beijing did this and did that. So that's my kind of...
Just one quick follow-up, and again, for any of you, there are many interpretations written about President Xi's speech, but he used the term, I don't know what it is in Mandarin, red lines. Any attempt to endanger China's sovereignty and security, challenge the power of the central government, or use Hong Kong to carry out infiltration and sabotage activities against the mainland is an act that crosses the red line. Absolutely impermissible. How do you read that? I mean, we all have our own interpretations, I guess, and how did that go over to your point about how Hong Kong people feel? How was that felt and received in Hong Kong?
Okay. Actually, in Chinese, he used the term bottom line, 底线, 底线 is bottom line.
Oh, that's quite different.
Yeah. I think let me come back to President Xi's visit to Hong Kong. This is big news in town, and we have covered that extensively. To me, the most important message from President Xi's visit throughout his 3 days stay in Hong Kong actually is this one country. His emphasis on one country. Without one country, there won't be two systems. So using his terms, one country is the roots and two systems is the tree. Only when the root can be strong and firm, can a tree can grow healthily. By pointing out this is the bottom line, you cannot advocate independence. That's the bottom line. Besides that, actually, what strikes me the most is he modified Chinese proverb, 成语, a proverb. The Chinese proverb was let's putting aside some minor differences and seeking common grounds. And he changed these minor differences into major differences. So the term becomes let's seek common ground by putting aside major differences. By saying that, he also pointed out that Hong Kong does have lots of problems, housing, youth, education, and also Hong Kong still lack of new engine for its economic developments. He pointed out all these different problems Hong Kong is now facing and acknowledged major differences in Hong Kong. So I think that's very important. It means Beijing realized Hong Kong is such a pluralized society. There are bound to be different views in Hong Kong. You cannot ask Hong Kong people to just come to just one opinion. That's impossible. So, but as long as no advocacy on independence, everything we can talk about this, so we can seek this common ground. Actually, this is quite consistent with Beijing's handling with Taiwan and all the other issues. Like Taiwan in Sino-US relations. It's also, as long as we stick to the one China policy, anything can be negotiable. But in terms of sovereignty and one China principle, it's been always non-negotiable for Beijing. So that's my understanding.
No, I appreciate it. And just to come back now, Ben, maybe to something you and Ronnie both started on a moment ago, which is the rise, which is another thing that I think very few people, although people as savvy about these things as you two probably could have anticipated, but which is just the skyrocketing meteoric rise of these other great financial juggernauts, particularly in southern China, that we couldn't have imagined. Now you know, so I guess specifically we're talking, you've mentioned Beijing, but Shanghai and Shenzhen. So the question is Hong Kong at any risk of losing its edge in that space?
Sure. Ronnie, can I go first?
Please.
Okay. So I also want to actually answer part of your former question. I think, let me quote. So basically, Hong Kong is a neighboring city, which by bus is 1 hour away, right? So the Shenzhen Shenzhen now, the GDP overall will surpass Hong Kong as a whole. And also, by innovation index, Shenzhen has surpassed Hong Kong as #1 among Chinese big cities. Why is that? So Shenzhen doesn't have one country, two system, right? So Shenzhen doesn't have this capitalism system, the good infrastructure Hong Kong enjoys already. But Shenzhen has entrepreneurship. Shenzhen has a bravery to lose, right? I had a house in Shenzhen, so I commuted before. I also worked briefly in Shenzhen for 2 years. I clearly feel the difference between Hong Kong and Shenzhen, right? So let me quote, don't ask what your country can do for you. Instead, what you can do for yourself first. I think by a few months later, I'll be in Hong Kong for 7 years. So can I claim Hong Kong permanent residency, right?
Absolutely, anybody, 7 years.
So
Welcome.
So in that way, actually, I feel ownership of Hong Kong, right? But feel a little bit sorry, left behind. But Hong Kong has been ranked by #1 as a global financial centers by different indexes. I look at those indexes by different what dimension Hong Kong does best. Okay, here I quote a few index dimensions. Okay, by business environment, cost of doing business, Hong Kong ranked #1. Okay, government efficiency, Hong Kong ranked #1. But economic performance, mediocre. Infrastructure, getting old, not great. Human capital, Hong Kong actually losing ground a little bit. For example, took me more than 12 months to hire a compliance manager. Compliance, we're getting more compliance work. So I have to hire one person from New York to put in Hong Kong. Okay, so I'm thinking about Hong Kong has such great university system, right? Why don't we just start a compliance program? So those things I think make me thinking. The Hong Kong actually will have a bright future, but Hong Kong, as a new Hong Kongese myself, we need to catch up more even with our neighboring cities. Let me also give you some striking comparisons. 20 years ago, in Hong Kong capital markets, the league table means who are the investment banks did the most IPOs for the companies. All of the 10 companies are global companies, global investment banks. Now, 20 years later, today, out of the 10 companies, only 1, don't ask me who is that, are global companies. All 9 are Chinese companies based in Hong Kong.
Wow.
That's the difference. Like Haitong, I have a few colleagues here. We use Hong Kong as our base. So we call our Hong Kong our home. But we didn't stop here. We actually buy a few companies. We built a few companies. We got an office in New York, London, Tokyo, Singapore, even India. I was in India last week. So I think our business, we actually not only survive, but we thrive in Hong Kong. So we hope our peers can do more like this to make Hong Kong better.
So losing its edge a little bit. By the way, in terms of Shenzhen, this may be one statistic that is not in your notebook, but I thought was fascinating. So I almost can't believe it, but in 2016, more skyscrapers were constructed in Shenzhen than in the United States and Australia combined.
Wow.
I mean, I don't know how many skyscrapers are going up in Australia, but Ronnie, did you want to add to that?
Let me again put things in a little historic perspective. Hong Kong has always been just one city, a very good, vibrant, small city, but very, very good. And we always service everybody else. We are externally oriented. We don't have, agriculture or manufacturing. We just don't have the land for it, right? And so after Second World War, we service mainly the United States, only country that have money. And then later, as Europe began to rise, we service Europeans, and then Japan, right, and Southeast Asia. And it's just a natural progression of global economy. The last 20 years, the biggest game in economics arena is the rise of China. So You know, there are some people who are still frozen in time that says, why should it be now 9 out of 10 are mainland Chinese companies? I said, you know, it used to be none of the American firms were there 25 years ago 30 years ago when I started. And then you begin to hear Goldman Sachs. I never heard of Goldman Sachs before, 30-some years ago. And then Goldman Sachs came, Merrill Lynch came, JP Morgan came. Nobody said, hey, how come now 9 of the 10 are American companies? Nobody ever said that. We just accepted it because we are always an open society, an open economy. And so now with the significance of the economic rise of China, so if more Chinese companies come and play, why not? A lot of people say, hey, Ronnie, you're in real estate, and now all the real estate, the land are all bought by mainland Chinese company, and so it hurts your business. I said, well, it's not a matter of me. You know, 30 years ago, the Japanese companies came. 20 years ago, the American companies came, and everybody come and go in Hong Kong, and now it's a mainland Chinese coming. And I'll be happy to bet that the first wave of them, they will lose a lot of money. So be it. We don't care. You make money, more power to you. You lose money, your problem. Nobody will have a gun to your head that you have to be there, right? But as Ben alluded to it, Hong Kong is not the end game. For these mainland Chinese companies, Hong Kong is too small to be the end game. But Hong Kong is a place where they can learn, they can, hone their skill in the international global economic system, and then they're going to go everywhere else. And that's Hong Kong function historically. So it's really no big deal that now we're servicing one client rather than the other. Allow me to stay away from the business for a bit and come back to what Tammy have just said. And that is Hong Kong people, you started but without finishing. That is, Beijing has to learn. Hong Kong has to learn too, and you mentioned. I fully agree with you. But let me mention 1 or 2 points about the Hong Kong people undergoing tremendous amount of change in terms of their self-identity. You don't live there, and so you may not be so aware of it. Under the British, we will make sure that we don't feel like we're British. In 1977, roughly, the Parliament of England Britain already passed a bill that says Hong Kong people cannot live in the United States, live in the United Kingdom. And so they were afraid that the Hong Kong people will have a British identity because we will all want to move to Britain, especially with 1997 in view. Then the Chinese have a terrible history in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s. So the Hong Kong people look down on them because they are poor, and they have a very troubled, checkered history. So we don't want to be the Chinese. So what are we? We're not British, we're not Chinese. What are we? We're honkies, as the Singaporeans call, or the Hong Kongers, as we call ourselves. But then that is always something that is unofficial. You don't talk about it. You are sort of navigating between the British identity and the Chinese identity. We always live on borrowed time and borrowed place. For the first time after 1997, the clock stopped ticking. No more borrowed time. And the flag has changed, so no more borrowed place. And so Hong Kong people have to begin to find our own self-identity. What is our relationship to mainland China? Are we Chinese or are we not Chinese? Nobody asked that question for 150 years because the British make sure you don't ask that question. Now we have no choice but to ask that question. Then finally, we have a second layer of complication, and that is vis-a-vis guys like Ben. His last name is Zhang, Z-H-A-N-G. In Hong Kong, there's no Zhang 30 years ago. C-H-A-N-G, right? These are obviously from mainland. Okay.
That's a difference between Cantonese and Mandarin, right?
So in the old days, we have a superiority complex. We feel we're better. Zhang?
Are you?
No good. Right? But now, these Zhangs are all Duke graduate, Harvard graduate, MIT graduates. A lot of them have PhDs. You have a PhD? Anyway, you have one. Okay. So what does that do for me? I used to have a superiority complex. I didn't, but Hong Kong people are general.
You always.
Now, a lot of Hong Kong people have an inferiority complex. They look at guys and say, hey, that guy got a PhD, and he is high paying. He is whatever. And then you have all the tourists come to Hong Kong. In the old days, we looked down on them. They just buy toilet papers. Right? Now they buy Van Cleef,
No, they buy
Chanel,
companies
and companies
now.
as well.
Now.
And so Hong Kong people is undergoing also a identity crisis. I won't call it crisis, but just an evolvement that is corollary or maybe ancillary to the 1997 return of Hong Kong to China. So I think that Hong Kong, it would take some time. No one can change their self-identity that fast. So Hong Kong people is in the process. I think that in the long run, as long as mainland China is doing okay, Hong Kong will be fine, not just economically, but also in terms of our self-identity vis-a-vis mainland China, the motherland, as well as vis-a-vis the people from mainland. So you are more than welcome. 7 years,
thank you.
3-star in your identity card.
So you may have noticed I've been handed the iPad, which means we're going to come to questions in a minute, and there are a lot in here, and so I'm going to toss out my own remaining stack, except to come to, I think I said to Ben before the panel, so as you probably know, the whole arrangement was a 50-year arrangement, that whatever the benefits or problems with one country, two systems, and the long process that Tammy mentioned she covered of getting to an agreement and arrangement between the British and Hong Kong and China was going to go till 2047. And 2047, of course, when we stood there in the rain 20 years ago, seemed like, that was just, it was really far away. It suddenly, somebody said you take a 30-year mortgage out now, that gets you right to 2047, right? Be that as it may, reflect, if you will, or not reflect, but give us a couple of thoughts about whether from a business standpoint, a political freedom standpoint, a one country, two systems standpoint, where do you see Hong Kong circa 2047?
Can I get the easiest part? Sure. I think
everybody.
I think let me use one example as you never know what will happen in the next 5 or even 20 years. For example, if you want to invest buy stocks listed in Shanghai or Shenzhen, you got to go through so-called QFII, QFII, called Qualified Foreign Institutional Investor Program, which is basically you need to get a quota. So everything you need to go to Beijing a couple of times, get a license, get a quota, right? Then in 2014, there's a Stock Connect program coming out. Actually, you don't need a quota anymore. You just open an account in Hong Kong, like with Haitong.
Of course, Haitong.
Just like a regular Hong Kong stock broker account. Then you can buy Chinese stocks listed in Shanghai and Shenzhen. And I think that's actually looks similar, but the underlying playing rule is different because you open an account in Hong Kong, so you have to be KYC'd by us, people like us, know your clients. You have to abide by Hong Kong securities law, not the Chinese by the QFII. So I think that's in business sense, finance sense, that's one example of what could happen in a few years. That could be one example of one market, two system. So predicting what happened after 2047, I think Hong Kong will do well. I've been living in New York, working in New York for 7 years, work at global investment banks. I studied, worked in Shanghai also for 7 years. Now I live in Hong Kong plus Shenzhen area for 7 years. Among all 3 places, some share commonality. You just mentioned, those outsiders, you do better. Actually, Shanghainese has that trait as well. Everybody outside Shanghai called peasants, farmers, right? So, but Hong Kong is part of southern China. I think people are very down to earth, very business driven. There's a good opportunity lying behind. Is for example, the Great Bay Area, right? This scheme, this actually only 5% of population, but 15% of the GDP of China, has a great opportunity. I think Hong Kong can do better if can participate more, not just a cross-border linkage, not so-called superconductor, but can do more. For example, do more fundraising, provide more professional services to this. This will work much better for Hong Kong.
Anybody else on 2047 Hong Kong? What will be on the front pages of your paper? We might not have the paper edition anymore. I don't know.
Yeah, who knows at the time. Well, I just want to share with you some of my own thoughts on this 50 years. I do believe when Deng Xiaoping mentioned this, 50 years unchanged, that's not necessary. Just mean this physically 50 years. I think it all depends on Hong Kong's value to China. Why Beijing wanted to give Hong Kong two systems? I also believe it's all because China needs Hong Kong. There are some people saying that, oh, if China in the 80s with China of today, with such a, so powerful, there might probably no two systems. Well, who knows? We don't know. After all, we are already being given this one country, two systems. And Deng Xiaoping has stressed for a couple of times, let's make several more Hong Kongs in mainland China. So we all understand Hong Kong has made great contribution to China's opening up over the past 30 years. Until today, even some people kind of arguing, saying that Hong Kong is losing our edge and our advantage is being diminished. I am still kind of optimistic. I do believe in Hong Kong we have our different legal systems. And we have, most of all, we have our free flow of information, for free press. In Hong Kong, there's no ban on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, which is, free flow of information is very important for business and all that. So I still believe Hong Kong can play a unique role to China. In that sense, even after 50 years, if the one country, two systems are going on well, why the trouble to change it? So I don't see that. So I'm still the kind of optimistic person. Yeah.
I have a very pragmatic answer. Tell me what China will be like in 2047, and I'll tell you what will happen to Hong Kong.
Yeah, good answer.
And the reality is, every 5 years, you use your greatest imagination to imagine what China will be like 5 years later. And for the last 30-some years, everyone has been wrong every time. And just look back 20 years ago. Yeah. What was Hong Kong like? What was mainland China like, and what it is like today? I was just in Shenzhen recently. Amazing, right? So 30 years later, that's still quite a bit of time. And what will China be like economically, socially, politically? Who knows? Yeah, yeah. And so, but whatever it is, I agree with Tammy that Hong Kong, being a small entrepôt starting, it's a small economy, small population, we have to service everybody. We have to prove our worth. It is said that respect is not to be demanded but earned. Mm-hmm. Same thing with economic success. And if we want to be successful, you cannot demand it of Beijing and hence always, as Tammy says, expecting economic gift from Beijing. That's ridiculous. Yeah. Eventually, we have to find our own way and find our own role in the greater picture of the China's economic advance. Lee Kuan Yew says the one thing that he admires Hong Kong, I'm sure other things as well, is Hong Kong's geographic location. If Singapore has our geographic location, wow, right? And yet Hong Kong people, because of the self-identity issue that I raised as one of the many reasons, one of the many issues, have not been taking full advantage of that economic opportunity. Hopefully, when we find our own identity, we will then also find our role in the greater economic picture of the growth of China. The world is breaking down the walls and doors to get to China. And Hong Kong is the only place that says, stay away, stay away, stay away. And some Westerners make sure that hey, stay away, we're different, we're different. Well, politically, of course, one country, two system. Why bother to do away with the two system? Hey, it's working well. 30 more years, wonderful. right? But economically, if you're still talking about, hey, I'm different, sorry, we businessmen are not that foolish. We go where the opportunities are. My father invested in U.S. stocks in the 60s because that's where the growth was. And then invested in the Japanese stock in the 70s. And now where do you invest? In mainland China, that's where the economic growth is. So I think that we have tremendous opportunities ahead of us. I have no question that Hong Kong will continue to thrive economically, but the process will take a little bit of time, find our own self-identity and our role vis-a-vis the mainland of China. Then we will rise even further.
Thank you. Mindful of time, and I do want to just come into the iPad. So if you have questions, raise your hand. We'll get a mic to you. We have a couple of very provocative and very similar sounding questions. Normally people send questions, I think, before the event, but these two guys are definitely paying attention. So let's honor Adam and Nate, whoever you are and wherever you're watching or listening. It's to this question about turning their backs on the flag in China. So I'm taking two and conflating them here a little bit. So what if they turn their backs on the flag of China? Isn't this just dissatisfaction over Beijing, meddling into the wishes of the special administrative region? Why would they not express dissatisfaction? Why is Beijing so insecure? And then Nate goes into similar questions and finishing with, why is it so unreasonable for people to want to choose their own leader?
First of all, about choosing the leader. Hong Kong is not a sovereign state. Hong Kong is a city inside of a country. I don't care how you do it, whichever way you do it, it cannot be incongruent with the rest of the country. You don't like the way Beijing is, you have your liberty. But as far as Hong Kong is concerned, as a very special SAR city of China, politically, we have to work in the greater context. If not, you're talking about sedition, you're talking about, independence. It's just not in the cards, not in the game. And we cannot do that. And as far as, what's wrong with giving middle finger to the flag, I said, do you think that in this country, if somebody were to give the middle finger to the flag, the citizen will accept that? I know that some some basketball players or football players, they did not salute the flag or something like that, right? But that's not like when they chanted publicly. I mean, F Beijing, pardon my language. I mean, I have to say it that way. That's the only way I know how to say it because that's what they said it. And so, it is. And it goes back to my issue of what is the identity of Hong Kong. Hong Kong is far more complicated than most people think. And in America, you never have a question of being one country. Even in your dollar bill, it talks about what? E pluribum, whatever that word is, unum, right? You have the unum there. But in Hong Kong, we never had a sense of being one country. Because Britain disavowed us, we didn't want to be part of China, and then we became part of China. So I think that identity is something that has to foster over a period of time. And since we cannot be independent, so you have to learn to live with the system. You want to overthrow Beijing, go right ahead, count me out.
Okay, Mickey, and then we'll take one in the back. If you could say who you are, keep it kind of tight. I'm sorry, I've left not that much time. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Minky Worden from Human Rights Watch, and thank you to the Asia Society for keeping the spotlight on Hong Kong. At Human Rights Watch, we have documented over a 20-year period that every repressive act from Beijing, for example, the Patriotic Education Program, creates the next generation of critics. It created Joshua Wong, for example. And it was distressing to see that the Asia Society in Hong Kong has turned down the opportunity to hear from pan-Democrats. So I'd like to ask Mr. Chan if he's prepared to commit on the spot that Hong Kong will have the free flow of information that Tammy Tam has referenced, and that includes hearing from peaceful critics, whatever their political views.
Good seeing you again.
I actually, yeah.
Please.
I don't mean to interrupt Ronnie, but just to be clear, because this has been unclear in a lot of this, I run global programming for the Asia Society, so and Ronnie's, feel free to add anything you like. I think you've probably seen our statement on the Joshua Wong business. We have actually invited him in the aftermath of this to come to an event. There were mistakes made, and that's in our statement as well. But our commitment is full-throated, and I'm not sure everybody here knows what we're talking about. Happy to discuss it afterwards with you. It's full-throated, it's unmitigated, and you can take that to the bank. Yes. Go ahead.
I'll make it very, very simple. First of all, as the chairman of Asia Society Hong Kong, we have stayed away from politics. Local politics in particular, but we stay away from that for the last 30 years, 20-some years that we've been there. We cover, as an institution, we cover business and policy. It's policy, not politics, okay? Number 2, education. And number 3, arts and culture. We are apolitical, we don't cover politics. That's why, under my chairmanship in Hong Kong for the last 20-some years, I have never invited once the pro-establishment camp to say a word about local politics. Never. Check our programs. We never invited the pro-establishment camp, and we're not going to invite anybody if I have my grudges. So why should we do programs? Why should we be dragged into local politics? Our brief, our program, our intention is to do arts, business and policy, education, arts and culture. As simple as that. So does every organization in the world has to do everything, such as get dragged into the fight between Hillary and Donald Trump? If I'm in a hospital business, or a hospital, I run a nonprofit hospital, do I have to get involved in politics between the Democrats and the Republicans? It's just not what we do. We have never let the pro-establishment camp do it. Why should we let anybody else do it? Now, so that said, it is said that Ronnie Chan is meddling in the programming. Well, first of all, I am the chairman. I get involved in many things. I was in California last Thursday. I read about it in the newspaper. Then I wrote a note to our executive director in Hong Kong. I said, what's going on? I have no idea what's happening here. I read about it in the newspaper. And of course, the newspaper said, Ronnie Chan is kowtowing to Beijing. You know, can you be a little objective and honest and look at facts rather than calling names? Calling names is not going to help anything. And in Asian society, we generate not heat, but light. We just don't cover certain things. I don't care whether you're pro-establishment or anti-government or whatever. We don't cover it. That's all. Can I have the liberty to do that? Thank you.
Yep.
Hello, I'm Sina from Mont Blanc. I have a question for my generation. 20 years ago, I was already overseas as Chinese immigrants. So I grew up in Japan. Later on, my family moved to the United States. From other people's eyes, we're just Chinese Americans. So I have a question for Mr. Chan. As the co-chair of Asia Society, what efforts are put into place for unity? For my generation, this is all
For me to play? Oh.
for unity.
For unity.
Unity, oh, I see.
Because we're, from my generation, this is all very educational. We're very educated about it. However, in our generation's eyes and perspective, we are really confused because the Japanese and the Koreans, they seem bonded among each other within their own community. However, my experience growing up, my peers may be first generation growing up overseas or born overseas. We just don't see the same level of unity among Chinese. And then through these educational platforms, we learn more about it. Yes, there are things happening at home which cost here. So as the co-chair and possibly a mentor for a young generation like myself, what efforts are you personally and your organizations are put into to educate us while promoting and supporting what's happening in Hong Kong and mainland China? What's more importantly, what's happening here in North America that you're helping us to to realize that we're Chinese Americans together, and then we're very strong, and then we're recognized as one strong identity. Thank you.
Well, you know, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the father of modern China, said the Chinese people are like a bowl of loose sand, 一般散沙. And that is just the way the Chinese are. I don't know if I can change anything. I'm just 5'3", a small guy. I'm nobody, you know. But I just do whatever I believe is right and good for society, and that's all. Now, we do some programs on, you know, Asian Americans and so forth in this country. I'll leave it to Tom to address that. But, you know, there are so many things to cover. But mainly, we are back to the 3 pillars that we do: business and policy, education, and arts and culture. And we try to, you know, we cannot be everything to everyone. But privately, personally, if you want to discuss such issue, I'll be very happy to talk to you, and we'll see what we can do.
Just going to take you up
after
on
lunch. After lunch.
That's what she wants.
After lunch.
On the subject of young people, different question, actually from Susie Jakes at China File here at the Asia Society. So this has to do with polls about self-identification. Ronnie, you talked about Hong Kong identity. That, and I'll spare all the numbers here, but that the numbers of young Hong Kongers these days who identify themselves as Chinese, and the choices here are Hong Konger in China, Chinese, mixed identity. And we're down to 93.7 who identify as, or up to 93.7 who identify primarily or exclusively as Hong Kongers, and that number has steadily risen over the years. And the implication there being, well, I'm not sure how do you take that? And that must be something, Tammy, you're well aware of in your paper. I'm sorry if I mangled the numbers, Susie, but...
But this has been always a hot topic for my paper. Young people's identity and young people's, you know, their sense of belonging to the country. And there has been always, we have covered lots of different polls, and we have different, you know, op-eds on these issues. I think there is really something wrong in Hong Kong. I mean, for the young people, they got so frustrated. We talk about this. There may be lots of factors contributed to these issues. First of all, there is we talk about this upward mobility opportunities for young people. Hong Kong's housing is getting more and more unaffordable. For young people, it's just simply impossible for them to afford any, you know, housing. And also, I think Ronnie has pointed out over the past few days, because we are now having, Hong Kong is an aging society. People are getting aging. But according to WHO's latest criteria, when you are 60 years old, you're still middle age or something. So the retirement age is getting, you know, higher and higher. And the young people today, they really feel frustrated that they see less opportunities. I think that's why our new chief executive has put education as the top priority of her new administration. And youth issue was also one of the key problems that President Xi Jinping pointed out during his visit in Hong Kong. So I mean, it's young people is our future. Young people's issue, it is a problem in Hong Kong. It's for the government and for the, for the private sectors, and how we can work together to provide more opportunities for our young people. So that's just my understanding of the issue. I think it's a real issue for Hong Kong. Yeah.
And I would compel any of you who are interested in more on that subject, or we haven't even gotten into Carrie Lam and her road ahead, but Tammy's written some very good stuff in the South China Morning Post recently about what she calls the rough ride ahead for her, for Carrie Lam. And I think you said, or you quoted somebody saying, can't imagine why on earth anybody would want that job right now. But it's good stuff.
It's a tough job.
Yeah. We are, I think, a minute past the hour. I'm going to give the last word, actually, to somebody not in the room. We talked about Chris Patton and Prince Charles wandering off on the royal yacht Britannia 20 years ago. I frankly hadn't really known what had happened to Chris Patton. He had some comments. Obviously, a lot of people were looking for him, and some of them were quite critical. But he said this about Hong Kong. It remains a terrific city, one of the freest cities in Asia. That is not because of Beijing. It's certainly not because of Great Britain. It's because of the people of Hong Kong. So on that
Well
note,
said.
Yeah. On that note, I want to thank you all, but particularly if you can put your hands together to thank our panelists. Thank you, Ben and Ronnie and Tammy. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know what Chris Patton's doing. Does anybody know what Chris Patton's doing? Well, maybe that's where I found it. No? He's 74 years old. I know.